Direct your attention towards something across the room this very second, a wall clock, a printed word on a label, or the face of a person you cherish. Observe whether it appears perfectly crisp, or if a gentle blur edges the perimeter that wasn't present 5 seasons ago. The vast majority of individuals experiencing fuzzy vision follow an identical routine. They consult an optometrist, receive a more potent prescription, and purchase new spectacles. Then, a mere 6 months down the road, that prescription requires another update, leading to increasingly powerful lenses while their actual sight continues to decline. Yet, there is a fundamental truth that virtually no one discloses to these patients. Eyeglasses do not cure your visual impairment, they merely mask it. Furthermore, the underlying catalyst behind your fading eyesight, the true physiological trigger, has very little to do with the health of your eyes themselves. Rather, it is entirely dictated by the chemical state of your bloodstream right now, even as you scan these lines. You have likely encountered the term diabetes referenced alongside the topic of losing one's sight. However, what that standard narrative routinely omits is a crucial fact. You do not have to be diagnosed with diabetes for elevated blood sugar to ravage your ocular health. A formal medical diagnosis is unnecessary, as is a high fasting glucose reading on your laboratory results. The real culprit is something far more elusive and widespread: blood glucose that aggressively spikes and plummets throughout your day. It involves sugar levels that hover marginally too high for slightly too long, chronically saturating specific tissues with glucose while leaving other areas completely starved of energy. This specific metabolic trend, which scientific data implies impacts the bulk of Americans over the age of 55, quietly ravages the most metabolically fragile tissue across your entire anatomy, your eyes. The retina, that delicate membrane of light-receptive tissue lining the back of your eye, maintains the absolute highest metabolic consumption rate of any tissue in human biology. Gram for gram, it burns through more oxygen and glucose than even your brain. Because it operates at such an extraordinary level of activity and sensitivity, the retina absorbs the initial damage whenever your glucose supply becomes unstable. Regrettably, no medical billing code exists to cover this explanation during a standard optometry visit. The technician's primary objective is simply to calculate refraction and properly fit you for a physical lens. No professional within that conventional framework is going to sit down with you to unpack the precise metabolic path by which glucose degrades your eyesight, let alone hand you a comprehensive protocol to counteract every single phase. That precise gap is exactly why this video was created. Before proceeding any further, I must highlight the critical red flags that dictate you immediately stop watching this content and contact a medical professional today, not tomorrow, but today. These warning signs include a sudden loss of sight in one eye developing over mere hours or days, a shadow or dark curtain sweeping across your field of vision, or a sudden eruption of new floaters where dozens of dark specks or cobwebs appear out of nowhere. Additionally, experiencing flashes of light in your side vision that repeatedly flicker requires instant attention. Any single one of these symptoms indicates acute retinal trauma or a potential detachment. These constitute true medical emergencies where no strategy outlined in this video applies, and you require an immediate, same-day evaluation by an ophthalmologist. If none of those urgent warnings resonate with your situation, if your condition is instead a slow, progressive blurring, an increasing difficulty deciphering small text over several months, halos surrounding streetlights at night, or a persistent cloudiness that your spectacles no longer completely rectify, then stick with me. What I'm about to outline is almost certainly taking place within your vascular system at this very moment. Let us examine a phenomenon that strikes nearly everyone dealing with fluctuating blood sugar, yet remains almost completely unexplained by conventional medicine. The crystalline lens of your eye, that clear structure positioned directly behind your pupil that focalizes light onto the retina, is composed almost exclusively of water and structural proteins. Crucially, it possesses no blood vessels of its own, meaning it cannot draw nutrients directly from your circulatory system the way your internal organs do. Instead, it must absorb glucose straight from the surrounding cellular fluid. Consequently, when your blood glucose surges rapidly following a meal, the concentration of sugar within that surrounding fluid spikes in tandem. When an excess of glucose enters the lens, a specific internal enzyme converts that sugar into a compound known as sorbitol. Here lies the fundamental issue. Sorbitol possesses no exit pathway to leave the lens. It traps itself inside the structure, and because it is highly osmotic, meaning it aggressively draws water toward itself much like a dry sponge absorbing moisture from a damp surface, the lens physically drinks in fluid and expands. A swollen lens is utterly incapable of focusing light accurately, The focal point shifts, causing sharp objects to look soft and text that was once legible in bright light to become a total blur. This is not a permanent structural modification to your eyeball. It is a temporary fluid shift. It is entirely reversible, and it perfectly explains a riddle that perplexes millions: why your sight is noticeably worse on certain days compared to others. It explains why your vision feels sharper in the morning hours before breakfast than it does in the late afternoon, and why a prescription written just 6 months ago suddenly feels completely off. Your eyesight isn't fluctuating randomly. Your lens is physically inflating and deflating in direct response to your blood sugar levels. The second metabolic pathway is far slower, completely silent, and ultimately much more damaging to your sight. The retina is nourished by the absolute smallest blood vessels found anywhere in human anatomy, microscopic capillaries so incredibly narrow that red blood cells are forced to move through them in a single file line. These tiny vessels serve as the ultimate lifeline for your entire visual apparatus. Without them, the photoreceptors, the 130 million specialized cells in your retina that transform light into the neural impulses your brain decodes as sight, receive zero oxygen, zero metabolic fuel, and zero cellular repair. Chronically elevated blood sugar systematically destroys these fragile capillaries through a chemical reaction known as glycation. Glycation occurs when wandering glucose molecules latch onto structural proteins and lipids, forming permanent chemical bonds that warp their architecture and leave them stiff, brittle, and broken. Look at it through this analogy. Your capillary walls are constructed from highly pliable proteins designed to dilate and constrict to control nutrient passage while remaining completely durable under circulatory pressure. However, when glucose glycates those essential proteins, the vessel walls harden and thicken, mimicking a flexible rubber hose that slowly petrifies into rigid ceramic. The vessel forfeits its natural elasticity, turns brittle, and ultimately springs microscopic leaks. The moment the capillaries supplying your retina begin to compromise, fluid and blood seep directly into the surrounding ocular tissue, causing the retina to swell and distorting the visual signals traveling to your brain. This marks the true onset of what clinical medicine labels diabetic retinopathy. Yet the foundational process of capillary glycation initiates years and frequently decades before any official clinical diagnosis ever registers. You do not require a formal diabetes diagnosis for this destruction to be active. You merely need sustained, cumulative exposure to glycation. And cumulative glycation exposure is strictly a product of how high your blood sugar climbs, how frequently it spikes, and how long it stays there. Not whether an arbitrary number on a laboratory printout has managed to cross a conventional clinical threshold. The third biological pathway targets a completely different region of your visual anatomy, and this particular mechanism is most profoundly tied to your dietary choices. The macula is the tiny, centralized zone of the retina that dictates your sharpest, most detailed vision, the sight required for reading, identifying familiar faces, and discerning fine details. The macula boasts the densest concentration of cone photoreceptors anywhere in the eye, and it is the exact structure that breaks down during macular degeneration, which stands as a primary cause of permanent sight loss in adults past 60. To defend itself, the macula relies on two specific carotenoid pigments, lutein and zeaxanthin, which serve as its frontline armor against oxidative damage. These vital pigments actively absorb harmful blue and ultraviolet light waves before they can strike and obliterate the delicate photoreceptor cells resting beneath them. They function essentially as the macula's internal built-in sunglasses. However, chronic blood sugar instability floods your retinal tissues with immense oxidative stress, creating an overproduction of highly volatile molecules known as free radicals that tear apart cellular frameworks. Lutein and zeaxanthin are rapidly burned up in the body's desperate attempt to neutralize these destructive free radicals. As a result, they are drained far faster than your metabolic systems can replace them. The moment the macula's protective shield runs depleted, damaging light strikes the photoreceptors entirely unfiltered, causing cellular damage to mount and visual clarity to plummet. Most individuals past 60 already present low levels of these protective pigments, simply because modern diets lack sufficient dark leafy green vegetables. When you introduce blood sugar instability into the mix, that depletion rate accelerates exponentially. The fourth pathway bridges your eyesight to a biological system you likely view as completely distinct: your kidneys. The human eye and the kidney share a profound anatomical vulnerability, as both organs are densely packed with a specific variety of microvasculature that is uniquely fragile under the assault of glycation damage. This shared vulnerability explains why individuals dealing with long-term blood sugar issues routinely witness their kidney performance and retinal health deteriorate in tandem. The identical destructive pathway is playing out inside both organ systems at the exact same time. However, the physiological domino effect goes even deeper than that shared damage. The moment your kidney function begins to slip, a systemic cascade triggers throughout the body. Fluid retention escalates, systemic blood pressure climbs, and the delicate balance of fluid pressure within the eyeball, known as intraocular pressure, becomes compromised. Elevated intraocular pressure serves as the primary engine behind glaucoma, a condition that systematically erodes the optic nerve. Glaucoma inflicts absolutely no physical pain and steals your peripheral vision first, progressing so stealthily that most individuals remain completely oblivious until substantial, irreversible damage has already taken root. Regrettably, the metabolic chain linking blood sugar instability to microvascular erosion, kidney stress, elevated intraocular pressure, and eventual optic nerve trauma is almost never presented to patients as the singular, unbroken sequence it truly is. Every link is interconnected. The biological mechanism flows strictly in one direction, beginning with blood sugar at the source and ending with vision loss downstream. Consider the case of a woman I will call Eleanor, 67 years old, retired, relatively physically active, and carrying no formal diagnosis of diabetes. She visited her eye care specialist twice over a 3-year span, and on both occasions, she walked out with a significantly stronger lens prescription. The clinician observed early signs of drusen deposits, tiny accumulations of cellular waste beneath the retina that signal an elevated risk for macular degeneration, but stated there was nothing to be done other than watch them closely. Eleanor was simply advised to incorporate more leafy greens into her diet and consistently wear protective sunglasses outside. She adhered to both recommendations perfectly, yet her vision continued its steady decline. When she began tracking her specific symptoms with greater precision, a telling metabolic signature emerged. Her visual blurring peaked in the late afternoon hours, whereas it was remarkably clearer in the morning before she consumed breakfast. Following a heavier evening meal featuring pasta, bread, or a sugary dessert, the halos encircling her bedside lamp became almost blinding. Conversely, after a day centered around clean proteins and fibrous vegetables, her visual clarity was measurably superior. She had never linked these clues together because no professional had ever informed her that her lenses were physically ballooning after glucose spikes. No one had explained that the microscopic pathways nourishing her retina were being degraded by the exact same metabolic force. Her fasting blood glucose registered at 102, a number labeled as non-diabetic and not even pre-diabetic by standard clinical guidelines, meaning it triggers absolutely zero medical intervention during a routine physical. However, her postprandial glucose, the dramatic blood sugar surge that occurs immediately after eating, had never once been evaluated, and it is precisely that post-meal spike, not the fasting baseline, that fuels the destructive pathways we have been analyzing. Eleanor diligently executed the exact protocol I am about to detail for a period of 4 months. Her afternoon visual blurring visibly diminished within the initial 6 weeks, the intensity of the halos faded, and her drusen progression completely flattened on her subsequent retinal imaging scan. To be completely candid, it did not reverse the structural damage that had already occurred, as dead tissue cannot regenerate, but the decline stopped because the toxic internal environment driving it had been altered. The fifth and final mechanism represents the most rapidly correctable element of this entire condition. 3 specific nutrients are absolute prerequisites for maintaining retinal vitality, and each one is severely drained by the exact metabolic imbalances we have just mapped out. Thiamine, or vitamin B1, is entirely indispensable for processing glucose within your neurons and the highly specialized cells of the retina. When your blood sugar hovers at chronically high levels, thiamine is rapidly burned up at an accelerated pace just to handle that excessive carbohydrate load. Clinical data demonstrates that a massive percentage of individuals suffering from blood sugar issues are functionally deficient in thiamine, even when their standard blood panels appear completely normal, because localized tissue demand far outstrips systemic availability. A thiamine deficiency inside the retina directly cripples the ganglion cells responsible for transmitting visual data from the eye to the brain. The visual signal doesn't vanish entirely, rather, it degrades, causing your sight to lose its sharpness, contrast, and crispness, even when the physical architecture of the eye looks normal on a scan. Magnesium plays a vital role in over 300 distinct enzymatic reactions, including the processes that govern blood vessel dilation and shield neural pathways from oxidative stress. It is also an absolute necessity for proper insulin receptor signaling, meaning a magnesium deficiency directly worsens blood sugar instability, which in turn accelerates retinal destruction in a compounding vicious loop. Clinical research projects that the vast majority of Americans over 60 possess insufficient magnesium levels, and almost all are entirely unaware because magnesium is routinely omitted from a standard metabolic blood panel. Lastly, zinc is concentrated within the retina at levels higher than almost any other tissue in the human anatomy. Zinc is the core element fueling the visual cycle, the complex biochemical sequence that translates light waves into neural messages, and it drives the vital enzymes that shield retinal structures from oxidative damage. Natural zinc absorption drops off as we age, particularly among individuals whose stomach acid production has naturally waned, which describes the majority of the population over 60. When zinc levels fall below a critical point, the visual cycle operates at a much lower efficiency, and the retina's antioxidant shield crumbles at the exact moment it requires the maximum amount of protection. These are three critical nutrients, all systematically drained by the identical metabolic dysfunction causing the other four destructive pathways, and all entirely replenishable through targeted, highly accessible whole foods. Here is your daily protocol. In the morning, ensure you launch your day with a blood sugar stabilizing meal before you allow any form of simple carbohydrate to cross your lips. Excellent options include 2 whole eggs paired with a modest side of smoked fish, or full-fat plain yogurt mixed with a tablespoon of freshly ground flaxseed. This strategy is not about completely banishing carbohydrates from your life. It is entirely a matter of proper food sequencing and timing. A morning meal centered squarely around clean protein and healthy fats effectively blunts the initial glucose surge, dramatically curbing the sorbitol buildup inside the lens that typically peaks in the 2 hours following breakfast. Your morning glycemic response effectively dictates your metabolic rhythm for the remainder of the day, so keep that curve flat. Later, ensure you integrate cooked leafy greens into either your morning or early afternoon nutrition. Opt for cooked spinach, cooked kale, or cooked collards rather than consuming them raw. The application of heat breaks down the rigid cellular walls that lock lutein and zeaxanthin away inside the plant matrix. In fact, a mere half cup of cooked spinach provides vastly more bioavailable lutein than 3 full cups of raw greens. Always include a teaspoon of quality oil or a small pat of butter alongside them. Because lutein and zeaxanthin are strictly fat-soluble, failing to include fat in the same meal means they will pass completely through your digestive tract without being absorbed. During the daytime hours, your absolute core objective is controlling the postprandial spike, that sudden wave of glucose that floods your system immediately after eating. Mastering this requires adhering to one simple rule at every single meal: consume your fiber and protein first, leaving starches and sugars for the very end. When you systematically eat your vegetables and proteins at the start of a meal and delay starchy or sweet elements until the conclusion, glucose enters your bloodstream at roughly half the velocity compared to eating those exact same foods in the reverse order. This profound effect has been thoroughly verified across multiple clinical trials. It is the identical food composition, just an altered sequence, yielding a drastically improved blood sugar response. Additionally, commit to a 10-minute walk immediately following your 2 largest daily meals. This is not a strenuous workout, it is a simple stroll around the neighborhood block. Muscular contractions occurring during and immediately after food consumption actively pull glucose straight out of your bloodstream and into muscle tissue without requiring your pancreas to secrete insulin. A brief 10-minute walk following dinner slashes your post-meal glucose peak by a clinically significant margin, standing as the absolute lowest-cost retinal protection strategy available to humanity. When evening arrives, your focus shifts entirely toward targeted nutrient replenishment. Incorporate a small handful, roughly 30 grams of raw unsalted green pumpkin seeds into your late afternoon routine, or right alongside your dinner to secure a potent dose of highly bioavailable zinc and magnesium. These are not synthetic pills, they are real food, meaning the minerals arrive bound within a natural matrix that your body easily recognizes and absorbs with high efficiency. Additionally, incorporate traditional salted herring from your local market into your weekly menu. Enjoying a 100-gram portion at dinner 2 or 3 times a week supplies critical thiamine alongside vitamin D and vital omega-3 fatty acids, which actively temper systemic inflammation and directly fortify the structural integrity of your retinal cell membranes. Furthermore, consume 2 egg yolks every single day. Egg yolks supply lutein and zeaxanthin in the most bioavailable architecture found in nature, far outperforming dark leafy greens and synthetic supplements alike because the natural lipids embedded within the yolk guarantee maximum intestinal absorption. The historical anxiety surrounding egg yolks and cardiovascular markers has been thoroughly debunked and revised within clinical literature over the last decade. The far more pressing reality for your eyesight is that egg yolks represent the most highly efficient, cost-effective lutein delivery system you can find in an ordinary grocery store. Before heading to bed, there is only one non-negotiable practice you must follow. Completely halt all food consumption at least 2.5 hours prior to sleeping. The final morsel of food you consume must be completely digested long before your head hits the pillow. Eating right before bed triggers a massive glucose excursion during the opening hours of the night, which is the precise window when your retina is biologically programmed to execute its primary cellular repair cycle. The hardworking photoreceptors that spent all day converting light waves must rebuild their light-sensitive outer segments, and they perform this critical maintenance exclusively during deep sleep cycles. A blood sugar surge occurring during that exact window directly derails the repair mechanism. Give your retina its proper recovery window by granting your digestive tract its necessary rest phase. There are 2 immediate observations you can make on your own without needing any specialized medical hardware. First, execute the time-of-day assessment. Pay close attention to whether your visual blurring follows a distinct pattern where it worsens 30 to 90 minutes after eating, particularly following carbohydrate-heavy or sugary meals, and resolves noticeably in the morning hours prior to breakfast. That is the classic signature of lens swelling driven by blood sugar spikes, not an incurable structural disease. Second, maintain a simple 7-day food and vision journal. For 1 week, write down exactly what you consume and rate the quality of your vision precisely 1 hour later. You don't need to be incredibly detailed. Just log whether it feels clear or blurry, or better or worse, compared to how you woke up. The vast majority of individuals who track this for a week discover a glaring correlation that their eye care specialist never prompted them to look for, simply because optometrists don't inquire about what you ate for lunch. How old are you right now? Please share your age in the comments section below, as I genuinely want to understand who is engaging with this content. The timeline of these internal mechanisms, how rapidly glycation damage mounts, how quickly your lutein shield drains, and how steeply your zinc and magnesium absorption drops, shifts dramatically with each passing decade beyond age 55. Knowing your age allows me to precisely tailor the topics this channel tackles next. Here are 5 specific steps you can take starting tonight. First, at your very next meal, consume your vegetables and protein first, saving the bread, rice, or dessert for the final bites. Second, take a 10-minute stroll immediately following your dinner. Do not delay this until tomorrow. Start tonight. Third, pick up a bag of raw, unsalted pumpkin seeds tomorrow and commit to eating a handful every afternoon. Fourth, incorporate 2 whole egg yolks into your breakfast routine tomorrow morning. Fifth, establish a strict boundary and stop eating entirely 2.5 hours before you intend to sleep, starting this very evening. The lenses you keep changing and the prescriptions you keep updating are not the solution to your fading sight. The true solution lies in radically altering the internal metabolic environment that is triggering the breakdown in the first place. Your retina is not failing simply because you are accumulating birthdays. It is failing because it is constantly submerged in a destructive chemical environment that is quietly eroding the finest blood vessels and the most energy-demanding tissue across your entire body. That internal environment can be completely transformed. You don't need an invasive clinical procedure or a lifelong medication to do it. You can achieve it through the deliberate sequencing of your meals, a daily handful of seeds, 2 simple egg yolks, and a brief 10-minute walk after your evening meal. Your eyes are not the underlying defect. They are simply the dashboard warning light. Now you finally understand exactly how to read it.